topic tonight is why reformism can't win reforms. I didn't prepare a comprehensive assault on reformism, for which I would lean more heavily on Lenin and Luxemburg. But tonight I'm going to focus on the reading, which is the Problems of Reformism by Robert Brenner, plus a short supplementary piece by Charlie Post. So first, a little bit about Robert Brenner. He is a history professor at UCLA. He's a member of Solidarity and editor of Against the Current, New Left Review, and Catalyst. He's most famous for the Brenner thesis on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and as a founder of what's called political Marxism, which I can't say a ton about, but I'll say here that it erroneously separates the political from the economic and prioritizes social property relations over productive forces. But anyway, on to the material here. Brenner starts by saying reformism is our main political competitor, that reformists share our program, at least in words, and that that revolutionary socialism is more attractive to people, or can be more attractive to people, not because we outbid reformists in terms of program, but because of our theory and understanding of the world and our method and practice. I would say we absolutely should outbid the reformists. For one thing, like, we demand a world without borders, and this is quite different from reformist demands. So immediately we kind of come upon one problem with the text, I think, which is that Brenner, it's unclear what Brenner, it's unclear what Brenner means by reformism. Does he mean liberalism, or does he mean reformist socialism? So I think these things are somewhat different, though they kind of collapse into each other. But liberalism doesn't aspire to fundamentally change society. It opposes fundamental changes, in fact. It upholds the current system and thinks we only need to tweak it subtly to realize progressive values. Whereas reformism, whereas reformist socialism seeks to gradually reform capitalism into socialism and eschews the need for a revolution. Both accept the limits of social change imposed by the capitalist system itself. So yeah, his usage is a little unclear, but to be fair, is reformist socialism really that different from liberalism, right? Brenner goes on to talk about the paradox of reformism. He says that throughout history, reformism has come from and served to rationalize the interests of a particular social basis. And he identifies these as trade union officials, reformist politicians, and the petty bourgeois leadership of movements of the oppressed. These social forces are committed to political theories and methods that end up preventing them from securing their own goals. And let's see, to hop over to the Charlie Post piece, Charlie Post says, reformism is the worldview of the labor bureaucracy. Let's see, let me move on from that. I don't know how to connect that point right now. The problem is that winning major reforms has required not only breaking with, but struggling against reformist leaderships and organizations. The reformists claim that state intervention can enable capitalism to achieve long-term stability and growth. They think crises arise from unregulated class struggle. So they seek to contain class struggle and consider it unnecessary or even harmful. So by unregulated class struggle, there can, in the reformist view, there can sort of be too much exploitation by bosses who are seeking to increase profitability, and that diminishes working class purchasing power so much that it leads to a crisis of underconsumption. On the other hand, too much resistance by workers, which is bizarre, reduces profitability, investment, and causes a supply side crisis, or can. So on to the reformist view of the state. Reformists view the state as a neutral apparatus capable of being used by any group, including the proletariat. Workers and from this flows the thought that workers and the oppressed should try to gain control of the state by electing reformist officials, by integrating and tinkering with the existing state apparatus. Because reformists believe state intervention can deliver long-term stability and growth for capital, they don't expect employers to oppose a reformist government. But as we know, as Marxists, as revolutionaries, the state cannot be neutral under capitalist property relations. Its managers are limited by the needs of profitability, which cannot be reconciled with reforms that benefit the working class and oppressed. Under capitalism, economic growth requires investment. And capitalists won't invest unless they can expect a good rate of profit. Even when the state is not directly controlled by capital, as under a social democratic or labor party, governments must prioritize profitability and growth over all else. In boom times, the capital and the state may be willing to grant reforms, but in lean times, only mass struggle can win them. For revolutionaries, much is riding on our contention that crisis is inevitable under capitalism, Brenner says, and I agree. Because capitalism is inherently anarchic, self-contradictory, and self-undermining, governments cannot prevent crisis. In the first 2 decades after World War II, advanced capitalist economies sometimes experienced an unprecedented boom, accompanying and seemingly caused by the expansion of social services and Keynesian efforts to subsidize demand. But the next 2 decades saw a decline in profitability that caused a crisis of growth and investment. Reformist governments not only failed to defend workers' wages against the boss's attack, but instituted austerity measures intended to increase the rate of profit by cutting social services and undermining unions. And this was true of the UK Labour Party in the 70s, French and Spanish socialist parties in the 80s, and the Swedish Social Democratic Party also in the 80s. Because the state could not prevent crisis, it revealed itself as entirely dependent on capital. So why doesn't reformism work? Why did the reformist parties in power continue to respect capitalist property relations and seek to restore profitability? Why not instead defend reforms, and if capitalists abstain from investing in response, why not nationalize industry? And Brenner says the answer to this can be found in the peculiar social forces that dominate reformist politics. Trade union officials and reformist politicians who are dependent on working class organizations, but are not part of the working class themselves. For workers, class struggle is the only way to defend their interests. For union and reformist party officials, especially during periods of profitability crisis, class struggle is the main threat to the viability of their organizations. Moving over to the Charlie Post piece, he says that anything that might endanger the institutional continuity of the union or party, especially illegal strikes and demonstrations, must be avoided. Thus, labor bureaucrats embrace reformist methods, routine bargaining, the grievance procedure, electoral politics. Trade unions and reformist parties thus seek to ward off capital by coming to terms with it and constraining worker militancy so as to avoid spooking capital. With class struggle ruled out, the electoral road is their only political strategy. And Post says that reformism seeks to build working class organization as a counterbalance rather than as an alternative to the domination of capital. Reformism seeks this impossible equilibrium to balance between capital and labor. And to quote Post, he says, the illusion of an enduring class compromise at home leads reformists to support their own imperialism abroad. And he gives just a banger of a condemnation. The relationship between reformism and pro-imperialist politics is not contingent, but necessary. And we've seen it again and again, most recently, there's so many most recently's, but the Iron Dome comes to mind, and the funding, DSA funding it directly. Just kidding. All right. So then Brenner moves on to talk about reformism today and regroupment. He says that popular frontism takes reformism to the level of a system. The Popular Front was first promoted by the Comintern, under Stalin in 1935, to complement the Soviet Union's foreign policy of alliance with enlightened, progressive bourgeoisies around the world to defend against Nazism. In the US, the Popular Front meant communists entering the Democratic Party. To avoid alienating FDR, by 1937, the Communist Party USA opposed labor militancy and pursued a classically social democratic policy of allying with the left wing of the trade union bureaucracy. This required rejecting the notion that the labor bureaucracy represented a distinct social layer from the rank and file. Instead, union officials were distinguished by their politics alone. The dual policy of allying with progressive union leaders and working in the Democratic Party remains powerfully attractive to the left today. But Brenner is promoting a rank and file perspective, which we support. Trade union officials are willing to make concessions to avoid confrontation with the bosses, endlessly chipping away at the labor movement and its gains. Progressive trade union leaders tend to be verbally radical, but practically conservative. And then Brenner sort of wraps up by talking about the need for independent political action, and says that an independent left third party cannot be created without the revitalization of the labor movement, social movements, and the left. These developments are exactly what reformist leaderships fear. Such revitalization and party building will require a break from and a confrontation with the social forces and politics of reformism. And clearly, reformists are caught in a bind. They feel they cannot break with the Democrats until conditions can promise victory for a third party. But a third party cannot be built without forsaking, for a substantial period, their established methods for winning gains via the electoral road. So that's all I got. Look forward to the discussion. Thanks, comrades.